Hello, welcome from the Asia Global Institute in Hong Kong. We're coming to you live from Hong Kong and from San Diego. Welcome to this webinar on US-China relations under stress, strategic competition in a pandemic. My name is Alejandro Reyes. I'm Director of Knowledge Dissemination at the Asia Global Institute, and I'm the moderator for this webinar. Our speakers today are David Arase, who is Resident Professor of International Politics at Hopkins-Nanjing Center, School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, who actually is here with us at Asia Global Institute.
Thank you for having me.
We also have Professor Zhiwu Chen, who's Director of the Asia Global Institute, and he's also Chair Professor of Finance and Victor and William Fung Professor in Economics at the University of Hong Kong. And also joining us is Professor Susan Shirk, who is Research Professor and Chair of the 21st Century China Center in the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. Of course, Professor Shirk served for a number of years in the US State Department. So thank you all for joining us. Now, we're meeting at we're having this meeting at an interesting time. Yesterday was the 31st anniversary of the Tiananmen incident, and we had protests here in Hong Kong, as we normally do, a vigil, as well as, if you look at it in the context of the protests that have been occurring in Hong Kong over the past year, the number of people that came out last night at the vigil, despite the restrictions due to the coronavirus in terms of our limits on the number of people in a public gathering. Yesterday was also interesting because the legislature here in Hong Kong passed legislation intended to criminalize disrespect of the Chinese national anthem. So I'm wondering, given the US action against China and against Hong Kong due to China's move to impose a national security law on Hong Kong. I'm wondering, Susan Shirk, if I could ask you, given your experience as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State from 1997 to 2002, which are really the formative years of the SAR, if you could give us your thoughts on what your perspective on what's going on in Hong Kong and on the US action related to Hong Kong.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for inviting me to join you. I've lived in Hong Kong off and on over many years, and I have a great fondness for Hong Kong. And I was really quite sad to see the introduction of the Hong Kong security law, because it appears to be a violation of at least in the spirit of the joint agreement with the British and the Basic Law, which always anticipated that the security law would be passed by Hong Kong in the spirit of Hong Kong autonomy. And given the trends in the tightening up of social control and repression in China, especially over the Xi Jinping period, that really sounds like we don't know how it'll turn out, but a lot of people are worried, including people in Hong Kong, but people around the world and people in the United States, because we don't have confidence in will Beijing restrain itself in how much it integrates Hong Kong into what some people see as a kind of police state or security state in the PRC.
Professor Chen, I'm wondering whether you could give your thoughts, because I know you've you know Hong Kong, of course, very well. in terms of its position as a global financial center. What do you think the impact of the U.S. action against Hong Kong? Could that compromise that status? Yeah, there we go.
Yes, okay. Thank you. I think in a bigger picture of things, it's really unfortunate that Hong Kong at the moment is at the very center of the U.S.-China competition, strategic or otherwise, because whether it's from Hong Kong's perspective, the mainland's perspective, or the world's perspective, it would have been much better to leave Hong Kong alone, in the sense that if the U.S. and China would like to compete strategically, it would be better to have the competition and the rivalry done or manifested in other places, other areas. But I guess given the pandemic and other developments, all those tendencies or trends that pre-existed before the pandemic got much more amplified and magnified. So I guess given this, then Hong Kong was chosen to be one of the few battlegrounds. And as a result, we are seeing Hong Kong's autonomy and Hong Kong's role in the financial world, in the trade world, and many other areas are being either reduced or eliminated. So I think from the Chinese side, for sure, there's a big price that China is paying and will pay. In particular, Hong Kong has always served as a very special buffer between the mainland and the world. As we know, China is still having a different system or different regime when compared to the West, especially the American system. So one would have expected more clashes to have happened in the past between China and the West. But because of Hong Kong's buffer role, such clashes have not happened. Well, now we are seeing, Hong Kong being removed in terms of the buffer role between the mainland and the rest of the world. But as this is picking up speed, the clash between China and the rest of the world may actually be more and more visible and manifested in very tangible ways. So it's unfortunate for us to be seeing this happening.
Thank you. David, I'm wondering if you could chime in terms of your perspective. Do you see it as China versus the rest of the world? Is that the where things are shaping, that this strategic competition between U.S. and China is kind of a broader sort of global phenomenon?
Well, there are three, foci to this. One is domestic. I think Xi Jinping needs to demonstrate that he's, large and in charge to his domestic audience, and carrying the flag of China forward, making them proud of their rise. And of course, because of the level of popular nationalism inside China, eliminating the cosmopolitanism of Hong Kong, making foreigners sort of more subject to Chinese law, Chinese norms, is a really popular proposition on the mainland. Now, inside Hong Kong, as you know, in September, there are going to be legislative elections that the Democrats could have actually won without this law if there had been free and fair elections without intimidation. And I think they needed to do this at the NPC now, because this gave them a legal avenue by working through Annex 3 to impose this law. And so I think there was a tactical sort of timeline or timing issue involved. And then facing the region as a whole, this is part of a large pattern of Chinese behavior during this coronavirus. Just virtually every Indo-Pacific neighbor of China has been intimidated, has been launching protests against China, whether it's, it's India, it's Malaysia, it's the Philippines, it's Vietnam, it's Japan, it's Taiwan. Just about everybody has been pushed around by China in this period, and Hong Kong just joins the crowd. So I think this has to be seen in this broader context of assertive Chinese diplomacy. I think they view the American weakness and division and this virus as being a strategic opportunity for them to make some gains.
Thank you. In fact, Professor Shi, can I ask you, because you wrote a book that's still, I think, really quite relevant today, China, the Fragile Superpower. And you talk about some of that the more, in fact, the robustness abroad versus the sort of fragility domestically. I'm wondering if you could give your kind of assessment and kind of update us on your view using that kind of framework that you proposed, I guess, 13 years ago now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do think that Xi Jinping actually has a lot more to worry about than even Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin. So the autocratic leaders without elections never really know how popular they are. And they have weak legitimacy because the people didn't choose them. They're kind of self-appointed by an opaque process within the Chinese Communist Party. So, and then the more modern and cosmopolitan, I like David using this term because China itself now has a substantial middle class, people travel abroad. It's not Mao's China. It's very different. It's much more modern. And so the more modern, well-educated, sophisticated, and well-informed people are, the greater the risk to Chinese leaders. And Xi Jinping, in his effort to concentrate power, and to a certain extent modeling himself on Mao Zedong, rehabilitating the Mao period more than previous leaders did, I think that he has more to worry about because, for one thing, he's not sharing power with the elite. And so he has to worry about splits in the elite, as well as the support of the public. Now, it looks like, everybody thinks he's very popular because he's a corruption fighter and because he's somehow got the common touch. But this style of governance is so out of sync with the reality of Chinese society today that, of course, he's got to be very worried. And also, when you put such a premium on loyalty, and including kind of obsequious ideological loyalty, you never know when it's real or when it's fake. So he's always going to lose sleep at night. And so the interesting question is whether or not now some of this overreach, international overreach post-COVID, is related to a sense of insecurity domestically, because of course there was a huge outcry at the beginning of the epidemic because of the suppression of information. The public didn't get the information they needed to be safe. And yet now it seems everybody's rallying around because they feel well taken care of by the central government. But is he still, for example, the Hong Kong move? My understanding is that's actually been in the works, developing the Hong Kong security law for quite some time. To us, it seemed like a surprise. But I'm wondering what our other folks think about that. Has that, was this something that was opportunistic because of the epidemic and domestic weakness or insecurity. Maybe he's not weak, but he just feels insecure. Or is it something that's been in the works for a long time?
Zhiwu, do you have any thoughts on that briefly? Yeah. We need to unmute.
Okay, forgot.
Zhiwu, you got to get into the unmuting.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Very good points. Let me add a couple of observations just to follow up on your points. One is the whether this is a window of opportunity for China to introduce the Hong Kong national security law. I think if we look at the broader context internationally, then probably one can see that in the U.S., President Trump is kind of acting in a very similar way. That of course, if we could have the setup that leaders in Beijing would have, Trump would just love that, right? And then in Western Europe, in India and other countries, very similar style, leadership and actions are also taking place. So that kind of broad international context has definitely emboldened whatever style or actions or approaches leaders in Beijing would like to take or are taking. So I think that has definitely made the legitimacy and the support level much higher, even actually among the elite in China. That may sound very surprising to many of us. We should be surprised, but we are living in a very confusing world with the free world leaders and otherwise all doing things that seem to all help make the attractiveness of democracy go down so much. So I think that has definitely contributed to the rise of whatever leadership style in China that we have seen. And then come closer to Hong Kong. Yes, if I were in their shoes looking at, when should we take big actions in Hong Kong? Where in some ways, as an outside observer, I would say at this point, the window of opportunity is actually there in the sense that there is this big electoral election coming up in September in Hong Kong. And if they probably calculated, if they would not take any action at this point, then there would be almost like a 99% chance. The Legislative Council of Hong Kong would be out of the mainland CCP's control. And then given the experience over the last year and maybe even of the last few years, they felt like, they had given Hong Kong a lot of chance to work things out. But whenever they thought there was one chance for something, for some corrective action to be taken by the Hong Kong government and so on, but that never happened. So in the middle of this pandemic, and then the US being so occupied with the virus crisis and other countries also in lockdown mode, then they probably saw that this was a great opportunity to move in. And then, I have to say, I was kind of surprised too that they would choose to force this national security law on Hong Kong, even at the risk of further alienating the general public in Hong Kong and the rest of the world. So I think if we look at things from the broader international context, then maybe this would be more sort of understandable in a way. Yeah.
David, can I ask you about your thoughts on the U.S. side of things? Because of course the coronavirus has given tested Donald Trump, and of course many doubts about his how he's delivered, and he's been using clearly the kind of blame China strategy, to try to deflect attention from the performance of the federal government in the coronavirus relief. What are your thoughts on that in terms of where we're heading in the context of this strategic competition framework?
Well, I think the handling of the virus on both sides has been very bad. And you started off asking about Trump. Well, there's a cynical, and then there's the more strategic way of understanding what he's doing. The cynical approach is to say, well, it's all election politics. The strategic approach is to counter the Chinese propaganda campaign that the origins of the virus are unclear, and that the U.S. could have actually introduced it into China during the Wuhan World Military Games. And so in order to counter that, in order to put the focus on understanding where the virus came from, how it spread, getting to the truth of the matter, what Trump's strategy has some logic to it. Now, the overall effect of this episode is to really gravely weaken the foundation for cooperation between both sides. The ballast in this bilateral relationship has always been economic, and it stopped the trade. It stopped the trade deal. Chances are the trade war is going to accelerate now, and the virus has caused China to act rather imprudently in Hong Kong, and this is going to force the U.S. to move into the financial area. It's already doing it with Wall Street, requiring Chinese corporations to submit to U.S. standard audits, and if they don't, they're delisted. But this could very easily spread to Hong Kong, depending on how the law is introduced here, and the fact that it appears that China's domestic security agencies will operate here openly, and guiding the latest word is they're going to guide the Hong Kong police. It doesn't look good. So this virus has really, in a way, been a catalyst or an accelerator of existing trends, and it's just pushed things. It's put us on fast forward by like 1 or 2 years in terms of deterioration in this relationship.
Thank you. May I remind our viewers that we will soon take questions from you out there. So feel free to send us questions by email or through the chat function or the comment function on Facebook. Susan, I'm wondering if I could go back to you on indeed this question. If we're looking at the framework of strategic competition, we've gone from constructive engagement to a strategic partnership to now this strategic competition. And I guess by happenstance, a couple of weeks ago, the White House itself released a strategic approach to the PRC, which outlined what it means by strategic competition. Is this the right framework in the sense that Donald Trump casts it as the previous presidents have been too easy on China, and now I'm the one taking him to task, and this is the proper framework in which to deal with China? What are your thoughts on that, and going forward in particular?
Well, certainly the relationship between the two countries had become more competitive going back quite a few years, really, going back to the Obama administration. And one reason, as Graham Allison would remind us, is that the gap between China's capabilities and America's capabilities looks like it's narrowing. But also, I think the main reason is because Chinese policy and behavior changed. we have Deng Xiaoping to thank for this long period of restraint that China undertook. And maybe, you know, people used to say, well, China's acting nice now because it's weak. But when it is strong, just watch. Then it'll show its true colors. Well, the argument I always made against that was, and this is what we said back in the Clinton administration, China's a work in progress. You know, you can't predict. And you can't, I do resist the notion that China as a nation, or even the Chinese Communist Party, is kind of inherently aggressive. You know, I think that it really depends upon what the domestic situation is. The domestic dynamics has the primary influence on foreign policy, more than anything about the power gap. But I'm a comparative politics specialist, not an IR person, so that's why I talk this way. But so it's competitive, but you know, competition can still leave space for cooperating on common challenges, common threats, like public health ones or climate change or nuclear proliferation. And that was the case in the Obama administration. Now, and in fact, the US and China over many years, going back to SARS, managed to cooperate on public health threats, even when they were at sharp odds over many other issues. So I actually thought that was going to happen this time. I didn't think the two countries would be so incapable of coordinating their efforts on this common threat, but they were. And so in a way, it revealed the really tragic level of hostility that already exists between the two countries. So, you know, it's not just the Trump administration that's fed up with China. It's not even just the United States that's fed up with China. China's been overreaching in many different respects, internationally and domestically. And what overreaching means, of course, is that you go overboard, you go too far, you overplay your hand in a way that ends up being costly to yourself. So I think that's what we're seeing happening today. As David pointed out, all these other countries are, you know, they don't like being coerced. They value a strong and stable China. They're happy to have their economies be intertwined with the Chinese economy. They want China to be successful. But what they don't want is to have their freedom to choose, their autonomy and independence be constrained by a too strong China in the region and in the world. And not too strong, too coercive, really.
Thank you very much. In fact, I commend viewers to an article just published by the Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Hsien Loong, in Foreign Affairs, which really deals with this issue of countries like Singapore, smaller countries that might be having to choose between sort of affinities with the United States versus China's more robust policies in the region. Zhiwu, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about what David mentioned, this idea of COVID as an accelerator of trends that have already been in place. You know, is that what do you see it that way? Or how do you see the impact overall going forward?
Yeah, I totally agree with Susan. You were going to say something?
That's fine. No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I totally agree with David's assessment that the COVID-19 virus has really only accelerated the trends and tendencies that were there before the virus came. In particular, I thought for many years, not many experts in the West really understood the true intentions of the Communist Party in China, in the sense that a lot of wishful thinking was mapped from their good intentions on the part of foreign experts to think that, how could they think otherwise? But to do things in this way and that way, from using the same values as we are familiar with in Hong Kong and the US and other countries. But I think even as the leader in China has been emphasizing and calling upon the party members to go back to the original intentions at the time of the founding of the Communist Party. I think in that sense, the current leader has really taken out or has been really showing the true color of the ruling party in China. I think in that sense, there's a lot of credit to be given because that just makes many well-intentioned Westerners realize somehow, what they were imagining to be the case is actually probably not really the case. Sorry for my sounding like so abstract and so on. For the reasons we know, I cannot be too explicit. But in any case, in short, yeah, we are seeing the strategic competition in front of us, and the pandemic has made that acceleration really possible in a major way. As Susan was saying, China as a nation has not been aggressive, at least in historical terms. That still remains largely to be the case, except, of course, a lot of 20th century politics having been imported from the Soviet Union. So that new sort of China, it's quite different from the historical China, especially given modern technologies having integrated to some extent the Chinese way of thinking into the world's way of thinking as well. So, but I think in some ways the kind of wolf warrior diplomacy being used to take China out to the world and so on. To me, that's an illustration of the inexperiencedness of Chinese leaders, even the elite, in dealing with international affairs. To make a long story short, as many of us know, the founding emperor of the Ming Dynasty back in the 14th century basically withdrew China from any international engagement by forbidding Chinese business people and others from going overseas by boat or in any other means. So basically, between the 14th century and then the late 19th century, for more than 5 centuries, China withdrew itself from the rest of the world. So that's a long pause in international engagement by China has prevented the Chinese elite from gaining any experience in developing international relations. So this is why after the Opium War, even to this date, the Chinese elite have not learned how to perform on the international stage. So in that sense, the kind of rudeness that we have seen by Chinese diplomats may be forgivable in the sense that this is part of the learning process to really join the world. I think my fellow colleagues here may not think the same way, but
can I actually go back to Susan, because I think, Susan, you wanted to say something earlier.
Well,
I mean, on the whole acceleration.
I think when China and the United States, after the epidemic hit in China, and then many of us in the United States, really wanted to help. We couldn't figure out how to help because the NGOs, normally I'd write a check to the International Red Cross or Doctors Without Borders or CARE or something, but there are none of those NGOs in China. China's Red Cross is the monopoly organization, is very corrupt, not efficient. That was a problem. Then the U.S. actually did try to reach out to China and was rejected. And the reasons for that are still kind of murky to me. I think one reason is that the Trump administration had pulled all the epidemiologists and the experts in the Center for Disease Control who had been to China and sitting in the China CDC with very close informal relations. He pulled them out. So we didn't have those informal relationships. So things really got off in a bad way, and then it just got worse and worse. And there was so little communication. I mean, basically all the dialogues, all the normal communication between two governments that I was familiar with back 20 years ago when I was in government, that we don't have it anymore.
Yes.
So the relationship had really been degraded, and it turned out to be, very hostile already.
Yes.
And so this illness then just became grist for the mill, and we had these two leaders, both very autocratic, both feeling defensive about their own performance, and it's just been a perfect storm of negative effects on the ability of the two countries to cooperate. And what's, of course, terrible is that this is going to lead to more loss of life. Because if the United States and China could work together, by the way, the US and the Soviet Union did during the Cold War to completely eradicate smallpox, if we could do that now with the treatments and the vaccine, we know that a lot fewer people would die. So this is really tragedy of the commons writ large. This is a disaster.
There's a lot of opportunity costs here. Before I go to questions, I just wanted to ask David whether he has anything to sort of add to that.
Well, I think this whole episode has also diminished both China and the U.S. in the international community. It's reduced their stature, their ability to lead, the moral authority, and I think it's going to contribute to the unraveling of the international order, because every country is now on their own. Nobody, even inside the EU, no individual nation has received a lot of help from the outside. Everybody's been left to their own devices. And if that's the lesson that people take away from this, particularly in the absence of leadership by the US and China, we're heading into a very different kind of era.
Thank you. Now, I've got a question from Mark Beeson, a professor at the University of Western Australia, a friend of the Asia Global Institute. We just put out an Asia Global paper on the decline of the West. So thank you very much for this question. So Mark asks, is the supposed moral authority of the US being undermined by Trump and the current domestic turmoil? Does this give China a free pass to crack down domestically, including in the UK? Zhiwu, perhaps you could take that question.
Yeah, I think this is what I was referring to, in the sense that the central government of China is going so harsh and hard on Hong Kong is a reflection partly of the global environment, especially what has been happening in the US. The propaganda machine on the mainland has been working overtime, trying to broadcast the turmoil and Trump's behavior this way and that way all over the place. Everyone knows the underlying message is that, you see, you want democracy in China, and then see what democracy will give or is giving to the American people. So I think this context has, to some extent, served to encourage the behavior of the central government in Hong Kong and also broadly abroad.
Thank you. We have a question from one of our Asia Global Institute colleagues, Casey Kwok, and he asks, and I think this should go to Professor Shirk. China has certainly overplayed its hands, as Professor Shirk has said, but has the US also overplayed its hands from the invasion of Iraq to the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement? And people remember the Paris Agreement being the agreement on climate change.
Well, yes, of course. That's a good reminder that unilateralism didn't begin with the Trump administration. So the United States, when we had a kind of unipolar system with the end of the Soviet Union, no other country kind of balancing against the United States definitely lost its restraint. It intervened in situations that were probably unwinnable, and our own soldiers paid the price of that, as well as people in those other countries. So that's why there has been a lot of support in the United States among the voters to a kind of retrenchment in US foreign policy. It doesn't necessarily mean isolationism. And now under Trump, we've seen when the US just goes it alone, it, retrenches from overseas, and not only retrenches, but alienates all of its traditional friends and allies. I mean, this is really going very far, and it has definitely left the United States without many friends. And so I'd say US moral authority in the world is at an all-time low. And I'd say that the actions of the Trump administration are more revisionist, in the sense of more destructive of the status quo than China's have been, really.
Do you think this will change if Vice President Biden becomes president?
Yes, absolutely. I think Biden's an internationalist. Now, it's true that the public wanted retrenchment, but they didn't want it to go this far. I think they're very uncomfortable with the Trump foreign policy. And I think the Biden, you'll see a reset of relations with friends and allies. And the question is, will they forgive us for the Trump years and go back to, a more cooperative relationship? I think they may, because the Trump presidency is so unusual, so extreme. And I think my son and I have been debating this, how fast we can get back to a kind of normal foreign policy. I think with our friends and allies, it may go okay. With China, I don't know. I think we have really damaged some of the goodwill among the public toward the United States and undercut the voices of liberals in China by the actions of the Trump administration, not just in foreign policy, but especially domestically. Look what's happening in American cities today with the racism and now the police brutality. So it's going to be very tough.
I don't mean to put you on a spot, but there's another question for you, Susan, from Munir Majid. ASEAN states seem to accommodate China's overreach, as you put it. At which point do you think this accommodation would reach the point of no return?
Point of no return, meaning they're
I suppose that
under China's suzerainty. And
that's what I would guess he means.
No escape, no escape. Well, that's, I mean, the real hawks in America think that that's the risk, and that that's why they're saying we need to slow down China's rise, we need to limit its capabilities. There are people in the United States willing to absorb things that are very costly to ourselves in order to punish China and slow down its rise, because they do see it like, Hitler's Germany, or, they really worry that it's so coercive and that other countries, China may not invade them, but it will basically control them through its market power and its willingness to use coercion on them.
Zhiwu, do you have, I see you nodding your head, so I'm wondering if you had something to add to that.
Yeah, what Susan just said reminds me of the old tributary system that governed the trade relations between China and the maritime Silk Road countries in the Indian Ocean and in the South China Sea. So in those days, of course, for more than like a millennium, the Chinese emperor did not care that much who the countries were and how the people lived their lives along the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, as long as they would pay tribute and kowtow to the Chinese emperor, then everything would be fine. So given that long history of the Chinese emperors and leaders not caring much, what the people who were paying tributes really were and how they lived their lives, I think that legacy more or less still carries on to today. I mean, I know many officials inside the system on the mainland, even among the diplomats. Usually their interest in learning more about the people in the ASEAN countries and other countries, that level of interest is not so much there at all. I think this is why the Belt and Road Initiative and other efforts maybe just, even if such initiatives are successful, they may just serve to repeat the same experience as with the old maritime Silk Road experience. Especially I've been asking my friends, in China, what did the maritime Silk Road really leave to the modern world? Do we have anything that we use today in the international order that was developed during the maritime Silk Road centuries? There's really nothing that is left with us from that period. So this is why unless China changed the approach and so on, even if the Belt and Road Initiative and other initiatives would make China invest a lot of money in other countries, in the very end, it would not really have, overreaching fundamental impact to improve the welfare of humanity.
Interesting, thank you. David, I have a question that can go to you. Julien de Trouillot de Lanversin from the United States. The West welcomed China in the international order with the hope that China would progressively adopt more liberal forms of governance with time. Today we see it has not been the case, and China has become an unavoidable major actor in the international order. Do you think the West should still try to encourage China to change from within, or should the West accept that a major actor on the international stage preserves or even promotes forms of governance that are not always democratic?
Well, I think the answer for the United States is provided by the U.S. strategy on China that was just released. We didn't actually get to talk about that, but you know, the bottom line in that strategy is that what the U.S. wants is free and open trade access to the Indo-Pacific. Whereas, you know, if you compare it, I think the right comparison to make with this strategy is with Xi Jinping's concept of the new type of great power relations, which he proposed as soon as he came into power to the U.S. And in his conception, it was that whatever we do in Asia, the U.S. and China must come out with a peaceful, cooperative, win-win relationship. So no matter what, that is the end state. The answer to this, and it has to do with whether the U.S. can make China a democracy or not, is to say, well, you know, we can't control what China does, but we can ensure that we remain connected to the Indo-Pacific, which is going to be the center of global growth for the next 2 generations, and the U.S. has to be a part of that. So the U.S. strategy towards China is to say, we can cooperate with China, but where we are not focused on a particular end state with China. What we're focused on is access to the Indo-Pacific. And you know, China can cooperate with us or not, but this is what our aim is. And so that strategy really is a refutation of an answer to Xi Jinping's new type of great power relationship.
Susan, do you have any thoughts on that? And
well, it's interesting. I'm interested in what David has to say, because I didn't think there was actually very much about economic access. I mean, to me, it's a pretty ideological type of framing. You know,
so
even things that are economic they're not playing by the rules, and it's all about values.
Well, there were 3 areas. I know: economic challenges, challenges to our values, to American values, and then the security challenges. Right?
So maybe David, you can explain what you mean.
I'll explain. So this report has to be seen in the context of, first of all, the national security strategy, which came out in 2017, which first identified China as a strategic challenger of primary concern. And then after that came the Indo-Pacific report from both the Pentagon and the State Department. So this has to be seen in this whole stream of Asia policy strategy. It can't be seen in isolation. It's part of a pattern.
How do you see, there was legislation that was passed and I think signed by President Trump in December 2018 called the Asia, it was ARIA.
That's right.
The Asia I forget the R.
Investment Act or something.
Yeah, something like that. That basically restated American policy. And my understanding was that was intended for the Senate, for the Congress to say, you know, whatever is happening in the White House, Asian partners, we have your back.
Can I jump in on this?
Sure. Yeah.
I think because this is a very frequently asked question and also somewhat a conclusion by many, even in Congress and the Senate in the U.S. I would say, you know, as someone who benefited from the open door policy and the reforms that were started by Deng Xiaoping back in 1978, this whole engagement strategy or policy by the U.S. That's really helped China develop and develop in the direction of accepting universal values and maybe even eventually developing democracy and so on. But I would say what did not work was the strategy approach, the reform approach, the gradualist reform approach, starting with economic reforms first, and then hoping that at the very end, when everyone is rich, then political reforms to introduce democracy and so on. For many years, I've been saying in academic circles, that thinking, I mean, this gradualist approach is internally, logically flawed. Because after many people become very rich, you want them to share power with others by sacrificing their own influence, forget it. So this is why the shock therapy approach would have worked much better, even in China. It worked very well in Eastern Europe and so on. Many people, including Jeffrey Sachs and others, have been criticizing the shock therapy. Oh, Jeffrey Sachs was for the shock therapy approach, but many others were criticizing this approach. But I think now in retrospect, if China had adopted a shock therapy approach in the early 80s, then we would not have faced this new challenge of everything reversing back to the Chairman Mao days in terms of how things would work. Because that gradualist approach to reforms always left a lot of room for someone to come in and take the whole country back to how things were at the very beginning. So I would not say the cooperative engagement approach by the Clinton administration and other administrations did not work well. I think as always, whenever you adopt a policy to do anything socially and otherwise, there's always some chance that things would not work out in the intended way. But I think in the case of China's reforms and the US engagement policy, it would be unfair to say the engagement policy was very ill constructed or conceived and planned. No, I think it's just the gradualist approach to reforms had its own internal inconsistencies and contradictions. That did not make the whole 40-year reform process in the end converge to a state of outcome that would be to our liking, right? Yes. It's unfortunate.
Thank you very much, Zhiwu. I know, Susan, you need to leave. One last word from you, just...
Well, I'm fascinated by Zhiwu's point, and actually in this book I'm writing called Overreach, how China's domestic politics derailed its peaceful rise, I am also playing around with this notion that, because I also wrote a book called The Political Logic of Economic Reform in China, about the political logic of gradualism, which worked great actually to start introducing market competition, but because firms never became fully independent from the state, we are left with this more statist type return to this type of economy now, which has become the economic base of this more repressive, autocratic, internationally overreaching system. So that, in a way, I think I agree with Zhiwu in that that's one of the reasons where we are today.
Thank you. I know, Susan, that you have to leave. You've got an appointment, so no
really
problem. I'm wondering, though, if you don't mind, we're going to just get one last word from David, but feel free to log out if you wish. Thank you very much, Susan, for participating.
I enjoyed it, everybody.
Yeah, bye-bye. Thank you. I just give David a chance for his sort of last word. So thank you very much. Thank you, Susan, very much.
Well, all I can say is that I've always been a long-term optimist, and I remain a long-term optimist. I think somehow we'll muddle through this, particularly in Hong Kong, things look kind of sort of dire, or pretty downbeat. But I'm hoping that in the long term, the U.S. and China will be able to manage this relationship without without actually coming to blows, and that we'll find a modus vivendi.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Zhiwu. Thank you, David. Thank you, Susan. It's hard to sum up what we've discussed. It's been so wide-ranging. I would only say that I too am an optimist, and hope that at least in the run-up to the U.S. presidential elections, things don't get too crazy. but who knows? And that perhaps going forward into next year, once the pandemic subsides, that there may be more sensible heads at this issue, which is a very important one. Now, thank you again to all our viewers for joining us on this Asia Global Institute webinar. May I just mention that we are having a webinar, an Asia Global Institute Asia Global Fellows event, live from Latin America and Hong Kong. Latin America leadership tests in the pandemic. This is on the 10th of June at 9:30 Hong Kong time. You'll have me again as a moderator, but we'll have two of our Asia Global Fellows and two Latin America experts here at the University of Hong Kong. So please join us then. Also, may I encourage you to come to the Asia Global Institute website or to our Asia Global online website, and to sign up and register so that you can receive information from the Asia Global Institute and to receive the weekly Asia Global Online. Follow us also on social media, on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. So thank you very much for joining us from wherever you are. Thank you, Zhiwu. Thank you, David. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Yes, take care.
Thank you.